This is Matt Cohen for Matt Cohen Photo Workshops. Today I'm going to be doing a video on one of the most basic things in photography, and that is the exposure triangle. This is sufficiently important that if you don't know this, you should probably stop everything else you're doing and get good at the exposure triangle very quickly. I don't know how you can be a successful photographer without knowing this. That's how important this is. Initially, what I thought, as long as I've been teaching, this is really held true, that you have to know the exposure triangle to be able to really do anything. In sports, it's even more important, but it's just one of those things that if you have a real camera, you just have to know how to do. The automatic settings, trial and error, all that kind of stuff is only going to be helpful up to a certain extent. I have students who have challenges learning things when numbers are attached, and I have other students who are coming to sports and rodeo photography from posed portraits, landscapes, family kind of pictures, things like that, where they don't run into the limitations of what you run into in sports photography, where we're almost always operating at the very limit of what the gear can do. I've been thinking about this for the last couple weeks after my live workshops, after speaking with the people who were having trouble learning this a different way. So I put this chart together because this is really everything that you need to know in one piece of paper if you want to print this out. This isn't the answer to every question. This isn't the perfect setup for everywhere you're going to go, but learning this is going to pay off. I guarantee it. There's no other way. Putting this at its most basic, what we're looking at, this is what the exposure triangle is, separate from everything else, like taking away all of the fancy words and tech specs and numbers, ratios, all of that kind of stuff. We don't have to worry about any of that to get the basics of the exposure triangle. The idea is that what you're shooting is being hit with a certain amount of light. And the goal of that is to transmit all of that light onto the camera sensor so that it can be recorded. This used to be recorded onto film. Now that everybody is shooting digital, certainly in the sports arena, it's a sensor. The principles to this are all the same. So I wanted to zoom in on this and talk about this for a second. As you can see here, these are sized and shaped a certain way. Okay. The sensor, it's a rectangle. It's always the same ratio, 2:3. It can be different sizes. Different cameras have different sizes, all that kind of stuff. The shutter sits right in front of the sensor and controls the amount of light that gets to the sensor by opening and closing, either very fast or very slow, depending. And then you have the aperture, which is basically a diaphragm in the middle of the lens that opens and closes, again, to let more or less light in. This is the very basic foundation of all of this kind of stuff. The reason that I'm teaching it down to this level is that once you learn this kind of stuff, you don't have to even think about this anymore. You just understand what's happening and can make adjustments appropriately, right? So there's a certain amount of light. The light is coming in to be recorded on the sensor. The sensor is controlled by ISO, right? A low ISO will be like 100. A high ISO will be 100,000. Shutter speed. A low shutter speed could be 1 second. And the highest shutter speed on most cameras is 1/8,000th of a second. Okay. That's the amount of time that the shutter is open and letting light hit the sensor. So there's a relationship between these two where you're opening the shutter is taking light and letting it hit the sensor, and you're telling the sensor how sensitive to be by what the ISO is. Now, there's always a third function to this. That's the aperture. This is why when somebody says, oh, you want to have a 2.8 lens, the 2.8 lens gives you a lot more light than a 5.6 lens or a 6.3 lens. This is the size of the opening that dictates how much light goes through the lens. And then the shutter also has a say in this. And then the sensor records all of that, right? So these things are always working in concert, right? That's why they're the exposure triangles, three things. And you always have to manage those things to get the right exposure. Exposure is how the picture looks on the final picture, whether you're looking at it on a piece of paper or you're looking at it on a screen. If you have the skin tones right and you have a nice blue sky and green grass, things like that, where everything can be seen, then you got the exposure right. And these things, shutter, sensor, and aperture, are the way that you control what the exposure then ends up looking like. So this is the simplest way to think about that is you always have to have a shutter speed, an ISO, and an aperture setting on every picture. And the extent that you get that correct is the extent that the picture is going to look the way you want it to. So that's why this is so foundational to everything, is that it's literally important on every single picture, no matter if it's sports or behind the scenes, fast moving action, a portrait, anything like that, all includes a shutter speed, an ISO, and an aperture setting. So we'll take a look at why those are important. So you can go onto YouTube and do a search for exposure triangle, and you will get tens or hundreds of thousands of results. Basically, if people are going to make a video about photography, they make an exposure triangle video. I am not going to do that. I'm going to do this my own way. And I've kind of set this up with an emphasis on sports photography and why sports photography demands closer attention to settings and backgrounds and things like that. Things move in sports photography, unlike landscapes or portraits where you have much more control over a situation. In sports photography, freezing the action is the standard. And if you deviate from that, you really need a good reason. In sports photography, isolating the action is standard. You need to set the subject off from the background. And if you deviate from that, then you need a good reason. And this is what leads us to the choices that we make in the settings. One thing that frustrates me is when I post a picture and I get a bunch of messages or comments, oh, what were the settings here? And it comes from genuine curiosity, so I don't want to turn these people away, but it's not important for me to tell you what the settings were on any given picture, because then you're going to have to reverse engineer everything back from there. If you keep in mind that freezing the action is the standard and isolating the action from the background is the standard, then you're 2/3 of the way there, right? Almost always at that point, you're going to know what kind of shutter and what kind of aperture that you want to use to isolate things, subjects from the background through depth of field. We want the higher numbers, right? 2.8, 4.0, those kind of numbers, 1.4, 1.8, 2.0. These apertures are going to give you the shallow depth of field that is going to isolate the subject and blur out the background, which is important in sports photography. Again, it's the standard. You don't have to do it every single time, but you need to know that it's the standard, and you need to know that you need a good reason if you deviate from that standard, right? Having wide aperture lenses gives you the opportunity to stop down. Having narrow aperture lenses, you just can't open up wide enough to do this. The same thing goes for shutter speed, although all cameras have the same shutter speeds, but the idea is that you're freezing the action. So what does freezing the action mean? Later on, I'm going to show you a lot of examples of what different shutter speeds get you. For right now, we're talking about the minimum is 1,000th of a second. Recommended for really stopping fast action, 1/1600th of a second, okay? The faster you go, up to 8,000, which is the limit on most of these things, the more frozen things that there are going to be in the picture. So if I was shooting a bull riding at 1,000th of a second, then yeah, the center mass of the bull is going to be frozen. Maybe most of the rider is going to be frozen, but there's going to be hooves and hands and fringe from the shafts and snot and things like that that are moving faster than 1/1000th can really stop. So that's why recommended is 1/1600, because then you'll get those finer details also stopping. So what does this tell us? It says that we want to be toward this end, right? We want to be the faster shutter speed, 8,000th of a second being, you don't have to be that fast, but we want to be more towards this way, right? Not towards this way, because if you have a 1 second exposure and you're shooting a bull ride, think about how many times that bull is going to go around, and you're just not going to be able to see it. It's going to be completely motion blurred out, right? So I don't want you to think of this as you're memorizing the multiplication tables, and the answer could be anywhere from 2 times 2 to 8 times 8 to 10 times 10, and you have to know all those different things. Really, what we're talking about here is directional, right? And that's why I made this the way I did, is because the numbers become way less important and the direction of things becomes more important, right? To freeze action, you want to go this way. To blur things, you want to go this way. To isolate the action from the background, you want to be going this way all the way down to like 1.4 if your lens has it. And the higher you go up, the less light is going to come in, and the more of the background is going to be in focus up to a certain point. Most lenses go up to f/16, f/22, something like that. So there's not an infinite number of combinations. You shouldn't be starting at 0. Like, oh, I have to look at this picture and figure out all of these things that I have no idea what I'm trying to figure out. If the action is frozen, you know that there was a fast shutter speed. On the ISO, right, we have sensors that go up pretty high, 102,400 sometimes, down to the low base ISO of 100. So this is really important, because if you're working at the low end, if there's a lot of light, right, and you can be down to 100, you're not going to get any noise or grain, and you're going to have better color. But as we know, as you increase the ISO, because there's less light, then you're going to get more noise and grain, and it's going to look washed out. And you're not really going to be able to fix that sufficiently later on. So for sports photography, what are we looking for? Low ISO, if we can get it, right? High shutter speed, right? To freeze the action, if we can get it. And then wide aperture. Right, to blur out the background and let in as much light as possible. So where we run into this is inside, when there's not very much light to go around, then you end up, if you have a lens that doesn't do 1.4 or 2.8 or something, then there might not be enough. Like if you're stuck, if your lens only goes to f5.6, which is not letting very much light in, and you are shooting at 1,000th of a second, these pictures might be way too dark unless you go up to 102,000, and then you get noise, grain, and that washed out kind of look, right? Whereas if you had, a 2.8, you're letting in a lot more light, and then maybe you could have a faster shutter speed and a lower ISO, right? Because you were already letting more light in. in the first place. So how all of this stuff works is that these are in stops. All right. Stops is it comes from when you're twisting the dial and it clicks and the dial stops. Each of those is a number, right? And those stops are equal to amounts of light for the sake of what we're talking about here, right? So when you are adding a stop of light, then you're doubling the light, and if you're taking away a stop of light, then you're halving the light, right? And that's how all of this works. So from 2.8 to 4, that's half the light. From 4 to 5.6, that's half the light. So as you can see very quickly, your light gets taken away if you don't have a very wide aperture, right? It works the other way. 2, right, is letting in twice the amount of light as 2.8, and 1.4 is letting in twice the light of 2.0, right? So it works both ways. The idea is that the wider the aperture you have, more light comes in. That's more stops of light, right? And then that gives you the ability, because you have so much light coming in, let's say at 2.8, that you can be at your recommended shutter speed for stopping action and still be on the lower end of the ISO. When you go inside and there's not very much light, then you're bumping up against all of these things, right? You have to be wide open, lets a lot of light in and isolates the subject from the background, but also has really shallow depth of field, which might not be enough to get like a horse's face and the rider's face in focus at the same time. That can be okay sometimes, and it can be a problem other times. But if you stop down to try to get that depth of field, you are taking in half as much light, which makes your ISO go up or your shutter speed go down, right? So these things work in concert with each other. That's why it's the exposure triangle, right? Because you are dealing with how these things all work together to let light get from the subject to be recorded on the sensor. And then the ISO says, okay, this is how sensitive we're going to be. That's amplification, right? So the low ISO is just going to look a lot better than the high ISO because they're just amplifying the same signal over and over again to get up that high. So a stop is interchangeable. If you move, and that's why, the idea of where that clicks is important, because if you, let's say you move the aperture, let's say you were shooting at f4, right? And then you move to 2.8, you're letting in twice as much light. So let's say you were at 1,000th of a second before, right? Letting in twice as much light from there is 12/50th, right? So opening up the aperture to let in twice as much light lets you leave the shutter open for a shorter period of time because there's more light coming through. The shutter can stay open shorter and give you the same exposure as you would, but the difference is going to be shallower depth of field and more stopping power on the thing that you're shooting. So if you think about this, it really does come down to directions, right? If you're moving the aperture one way, then you need to move the shutter the other way. And this is how you can estimate where you are without knowing. I'll give you a really good example of this. When we were in Chicago shooting bull riding inside, there were very, very bright LED lights. Like if you looked up, it hurt your eyes, but there weren't very many of them and they weren't aimed evenly across. So you could say in one corner it was going to be lighter, in the other corner it was going to be darker, and you could adjust for this, any number of ways. You could, when something was happening in the darker corner, you could raise the ISO, you could lower the shutter speed, or you could widen the aperture, right? If something was happening in the brighter section, then you're doing all the opposite. You're pushing up the shutter speed, you're stopping down on the aperture, and you're lowering the ISO, right? What you don't want to do is get into a situation, and a lot of people find themselves in this situation where more or less what the exposure triangle is telling you. You show up at a covered arena or a night rodeo that doesn't have very good lighting, and your camera is telling you, well, okay, you have an f4 lens, so it's saying, okay, be at f4, and it's saying the highest ISO that you can shoot without it becoming super grainy is, 6400 or something, 12,800 maybe, right? Somewhere in there, right? That gets too noisy, too grainy. It gives you that washed out look and takes away the color, right? Because you're too high, it's being amplified. You're getting more noise than signal at that point. That's when you get noise and grain, right? So let's say you're at f4 because that's the fastest your lens can do. Let's say you're at 6400 or 12,800 because that's the best your camera can do and still make a picture, right? And then you're doing the rest of the calculation. You're figuring out that you need to be at 1/250th of a second to get a proper exposure. Well, the problem with shooting sports at 1/250th is that almost everything is going to be motion blurred, right? And if you're shooting with a long enough lens, there's going to be camera shake. All of this stuff is going to make pictures look worse. So this picture is going to look grainy because it's a high ISO, and it's going to look blurry because there's camera shake and motion blur because you're shooting sports at 1/250th of a second when you need to be at emergency speed of 1,000th of a second minimum, right? When something like this happens, you are shooting in a situation where you're very unlikely to get good pictures no matter what, right? You could spend a lot of money on arena strobes and a lot of time setting them up and troubleshooting them and all that kind of stuff. But if you're in an indoor arena where your settings are saying to get a proper exposure, right? Something that people who were looking at the picture later could see all the details. Skin looks like skin, background looks like background, all that kind of stuff. The best shutter speed you can get is 1/250th of a second. That's just not going to get it done for sports, right? This is why I say you have to be very careful when you're picking the places that you shoot. This is why I go looking for light, because the more light you have, the more different varieties of pictures that you can get, right? Because you have all of the different options. You can shoot wide open with a very fast shutter speed. You can slow it down a little bit and stop down and get that little bit of, extra things in focus. If you're trying to do like a whole arena or something like that, you don't want to shoot at 2.8, right? It'll look messy. So the idea is that more light is better, and less light is going to definitely hamper your ability to do different things. And these are things that you cannot fix in post-processing. You can do lots of noise reduction or whatever. It's still not going to look like it would look at a low ISO. And if you started out by shooting at 2/50th of a second, you can't fix motion blur after, right? It's just going to look blurry. It's going to look not sharp. It's going to look a mess every single time, right? So that's why shooting indoors in these covered arenas or nighttime rodeos that have bad lighting, that's why those pictures don't look good, is there's simply not enough light to go around for the exposure, for the aperture that you have, and for the ISO without it looking messy, right? It's really important that you get that, because I say this to people who I talk to. I couldn't walk into some of these arenas and get a good picture, right? Even if, let's say, I go in there with a faster lens. Let's say I go in there with a 2.8 lens instead of f4, and I shoot at 6400, and instead of 1/250th, which is what that person was shooting when it was f4, right? So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to shoot at 1/500th, right? Because that's one stop faster shutter speed and one stop wider aperture. So it's letting in more light, and I'm letting the shutter speed go faster, right? So these settings are equivalent. The exposure is going to be more or less the same, f4 and 1/250th, or 2.8 and 1/500th, right? That's just how exposure works. Even then, right, would you be able to shoot bull riding at 1/500th of a second? Kind of, but there's going to be motion blur. Again, in the hooves, in the hands and feet of the cowboy, in the fringe, in the bull, if it's moving very fast, like if it's dipping its head or something like that. all of that stuff is going to move faster than the ability of 1/500th of a second shutter speed to freeze that, right? It's just going to look blurred and messed up. And if you don't know what's contributing to that, right? Let's say you thought it was focus blur because you missed the focus instead of motion blur because you were at too slow of a shutter speed. It's going to be very difficult to troubleshoot what you were doing and find your way into a better exposure, a better set of settings that you're using, right? So the idea is if you can't get 1,000th of a second, no matter what else, right? Let's say you're shooting at f4 or something. It doesn't matter what the f-stop is of your lens. If you can't have enough light so that 1,000th of a second is the right exposure and the setting that you're using, it's not worth shooting somewhere because you're not shooting sports at that point, right? You're shooting blurry horses and bulls and whatever else is happening. It's not going to look good. You can't fix it later on, and you're just wasting your time at that point, right? So I want people to, this picture, the raw part of this picture is loaded on the Ko-Fi page. And I want you to, you don't have to memorize this, but I want you to memorize like the principles of it, right? What does a fast shutter speed get you that a slow shutter speed doesn't, right? Fast, 1,000, 1,000th here all the way up to 8,000th of a second is, it restricts the light. It's opening and closing very quickly, right? That light is getting to the sensor in smaller and smaller bits the faster the shutter speed is. Fast gets you sharp lines and it freezes action. Slow gets you motion blur, right? You have to use a slower shutter speed for panning, but that's also motion blur, right? Because you're moving the camera to blur out the background as you're panning on the subject, right? So it's important to know all of those things, but you don't have to memorize all of the different numbers in between. You don't have to know that it goes from 1/250th of a second to 1/320th of a second to 500. You don't have to memorize those things. You just have to know that those are the stops that you have to choose on the way to where you're going, right? And it's the same, if as we look down here at apertures, right? So this is really important because, again, the default in sports photography is isolating the action from the background. So it's not neutral what you're doing. Like having the bunch of ad boards and telephone poles and trucks in the background of a picture, that's really not the way you want to go at all, right? So shooting sports, we're going to be at narrow apertures, very rarely, right? Narrow apertures when you're doing something special, when you're panning, when you really want to restrict the light that's coming in, then you want to be at a narrow aperture. But otherwise, you want to be at the wide aperture, also called fast, right? So wide apertures are fast apertures, 2.8, down to 1.4, right? These over here, 22, 16, 11, these are slow, narrow apertures, high number f-stops, where the other ones are low number f-stops, right? So whichever way this makes sense to memorize it, these all, these are all the equivalent of each other, right? So whatever works, you can look at it that way. The other thing, obviously, wide, think about it like a thick drinking straw. If you're trying to drink a milkshake or something like that, imagine trying to drink a milkshake in the f22 straw. It's going to be almost impossible, right? Whereas the 2.8 is going to let a lot of the milkshake through. That's light. So 2.8 is letting the light pass. f22 is restricting almost all of the light. And then how it relates to sports photography is that the wide apertures are going to let you isolate the subject and blur the background, which is shallow depth of field. Narrow apertures are going to put everything in focus. There's not going to be any separation between the subject and the background. This is, no depth of field, right? Everything is flat. So that's really important as far as the aperture goes. And then you can see how these are different choices. The aperture and the shutter are different ways of getting light to the sensor or restricting it, right? Getting light to restricting it, getting light to restricting it, right? So these are all the different controls that you have to do that. And again, you don't have to memorize each of the individual combinations of all of this. You don't have to know 8,000th of a second at 2.8 at 3200 ISO, right? You just have to be able to know which direction you're going, and then you can trial and error your way into the settings that work, right? And then looking at the sensor part of this, right? The sensor, the only control you have over the sensor, which is the thing that converts the light that the lens, aperture, and the shutter are letting through, that converts that into data, right? And the way you control this is by sensitivity ISO, right? So the sensor is very low sensitivity when you have it at 100 ISO. That means it needs a lot of light to make a picture. But that light is going to result in no noise or grain and better color because that's the base ISO. That's what the camera was made to work at as a default. As you move up this way, right, these signals have to get amplified. When you amplify signals, you also amplify the noise. So as you're getting up to the highest ISO, you don't need as much light, right, because this is amplifying the light that's there. But what happens is there's more noise, grain. This is what we called it when it was film. But it's not just the noise and the grain. You get that washed out kind of look where the colors don't pop because everything just kind of looks hazy and muddy kind of. That's why you want to shoot at the lowest ISO you can, maybe the fastest shutter that you can, and maybe the widest open aperture that you can. And you use those as a starting point, and then you make changes as you're shooting for what you're shooting and where you're shooting it, right? So really important that you know all of this. This is just the intro for this. I'm going to pull a bunch of pictures that show the effects of all of this. Like there will be a shutter speed video that shows different pictures of mine that have different levels of freezing the action and motion blur in them. Then there'll be an aperture one that shows how aperture looks on pictures from the really isolated subject and the blurred out background where you can't even see anything, to ones where basically everything is in focus and you can see the subject but also read something on the guy's cap who's 40 yards behind him, right? And then ISO, I'll show examples of what happens as you have to jack up the ISO and how the pictures suffer based on that. So there will be 3 more videos that come off of this one, and we're going to build some basics based on this. If you are having trouble with this, please let me know. I can't stress enough how much you will struggle until not only you know this stuff, but it's like just second nature to you where you don't have to actually think about it all the time. It shouldn't take you that long. You're just memorizing 3 directions, right? Wider, narrow aperture, lower, higher ISO, slower, faster shutter, right? Once you build that system in your head, oh, I can't shoot sports below 1,000th of a second, and I should really be at 1,600. This lens that only does 6.3 as the widest f-stop isn't going to work for me very much because I'm shooting in dark places and I'm shooting sports, which demands that I isolate the subject from the background, and you need 2.8 to do that, not 6.3, right? To where you're making a trade-off when you set your ISO. A little bit higher is going to let you work with less light, but it's also going to make the picture look a little bit worse. Putting it down means you're going to have to go find light, but those pictures aren't going to have the noise and the grain, and they're going to have better colors. So these things are really important. Please get with me if this is completely foreign to you. It's not your fault, right? People buy cameras, they don't know, what they're supposed to be looking for or doing or something like that. But the thing is that unless you ask for help and correct this problem, you're just going to be making pictures that are not as good as you can be making if you knew all of this stuff. And also, if you made it second nature, that would be another jump in your photography. So please get at me. I'm also, like I said, going to make 3 other videos based on this. So that should really bring things home. But I'm looking for people to tell me if this isn't as clear as I think it is, right? What I think of how clear this is not important at all. You understanding this and being able to put it to use when you go out and shoot is the only thing that's important. So please let me know. Send me a message, Instagram, Ko-Fi, whatever. It does not matter where. I just want to hear from you if you need more help on this, please. So this has been a look at the exposure triangle, and I am Matt Cohen for Matt Cohen Photo Workshops. Thanks for watching.